If you've spent any time on the modern internet, you've already met her. She's the woman in the soft focus videos kneading sourdough like it's a spiritual practice. She's the tradwife aesthetic with the prairie dress and the suspiciously empty bank account. She's the influencer explaining that women are naturally nurturing, gentle, and selfless, and therefore probably shouldn't be in charge of things like governments, corporations, or their own bodies. She's also lurking in politics whenever someone starts talking about family values, and somehow that always means that women do unpaid labor while smiling politely about it. And here's the thing. This woman is not new. She's Victorian. She's the angel in the house, and the house is a cage. Because the Victorian ideal woman was supposed to be fragile, spiritual, decorative, and morally superior, while also being responsible for everyone else's behavior. She was meant to be the ethical backbone of the family without ever actually being allowed authority. She was praised endlessly, pedestalized dramatically, and punished immediately if she ever tried to step off the pedestal and do something with her own life. The angel in the house wasn't a compliment, it was a performance review. If this ideal were a job description, it would look something like this. Unpaid labor? Required. Sexual purity? Mandatory. Emotional regulation for the entire household? Non-negotiable. Ambition? Absolutely not. Smile while doing it? Yeah, or else. The benefits package included social approval, as long as you behaved, and lifelong blame when anything went wrong. Because if a man failed, it was society's fault. If a woman failed, it was a moral catastrophe. And here's the argument I want us to keep front and center during this episode, because it explains a lot more than just the 19th century. The cult of domesticity didn't simply reflect Victorian society. It manufactured it. It created a gender system that made women responsible for everything while granting them authority over nothing. Women were the moral center of the home, but couldn't own property. They were the spiritual guardians of the family, but couldn't vote. They were deemed too pure for public life, yet somehow expected to clean up everyone else's mess and call it love. So in this episode, we're going to unpack how that happened. We're going to talk about separate spheres as ideology. We're going to look at how this fantasy was sold through magazines, literature, fashion, and the whole obsession with the right kind of man. We're going to talk about who was excluded and punished by this system. We're going to see how it hardened into law and medicine. And finally, we're going to ask why the ghost of the angel in the house is still haunting modern politics, culture, and your Instagram feed. Because history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rebrand. I'm Professor Meredith, and this is How to Be a Woman, Victorian edition.
Something that's, kind of bitchy.
Pretty bitchy.
Bitchy? I know.
It's just, bitchy.
Well, first of all, you're a little bitchy. That's next level bitchy.
If you want to understand Victorian gender roles without getting lost in corsets and calling cards, here's the trick. You have to hold two truths in your head at the same time. And yes, they do directly contradict each other. That's the point. On the one hand, the Victorian era is absolutely an extension of a long, deeply entrenched patriarchal system. Power, money, legal authority, political voice, and institutional legitimacy remain overwhelmingly male. On the other hand, this is a very real period of determined and increasingly visible challenges to women's exclusion from those same places. Both are happening simultaneously, neither cancels the other out. So when people say, well, women had no rights back then, that's only half the story. And when people say, but things were getting better, that's also only half the story. The Victorian period is a moment of tension, a moment where the idea that male supremacy is natural starts to wobble, but the structures that enforce it end up digging in harder. That's the shift we're dealing with here. Victorian society begins to move away from openly claiming that men rule because God or biology said so, and toward a more modern argument. Men rule because they are better suited for the public world. Women, meanwhile, are better suited for the private one. It's not domination anymore, it's complementarianism. It's not exclusion, it's specialization. Which is how the patriarchy rebuilds itself when it senses a PR problem. This is also where pseudoscience enters the chat. Social Darwinism becomes the velvet rope outside equality's nightclub. Evolutionary language is used to argue that hierarchy is not just inevitable, but beneficial. Men are framed as competitive, rational, and suited to struggle. Women are framed as nurturing, passive, and evolutionarily optimized for care work. And suddenly, denying women power isn't oppression, It's biology. Sorry, ladies, the clipboard says no. Enter the doctrine of separate spheres, which honestly is one of the most successful ideological cheat codes that patriarchy has ever deployed. Here's the split, clean and brutal. Women are defined as physically weak but morally superior. Their proper place is the home, where they serve as spiritual guardians, emotional stabilizers, and decorative trophies. They are meant to civilize men, raise children, and embody virtue without ever needing to test it in the real world. The home becomes their stage, their altar, and their enclosure. Men, meanwhile, are defined as physically strong but morally weak. They belong in the public sphere, which is understood to be amoral by default. Politics is dirty, business is ruthless, competition is brutal, and that's fine. Men are expected to engage in struggle, ambition, and dominance, then return home to be soothed by a wife who absorbs the consequences of all that mess and calls it love. This is the scam at the heart of separate spheres. Women are assigned virtue without power. Men are assigned power without accountability. And everyone is told this is natural, harmonious, and good for society. Everyone loses under this system, but not equally. Women lose legal autonomy, economic independence, and public voice. Men lose emotional literacy, intimacy, and any excuse to develop moral accountability outside the home. The system creates brittle men and exhausted women, then acts shocked when everyone is fucking miserable. But let's talk about men for a moment, because Victorian masculinity was not exactly a spa day either, and understanding that pressure helps explain why this system sticks. Becoming a man in the Victorian world means detaching yourself from the home and its so-called feminine comforts. Masculinity was not something you were, it was something you proved. You proved it through material success, professional recognition, and public respect. You proved it by competing, by achieving, and crucially, by being seen achieving by other men. As literary scholar Michael Patrick Gillespie puts it, throughout the 19th century, certain values occupied a central position in the Victorian consciousness: duty, respectability, commercial success, and middle-class morality. These weren't optional, they were the measuring stick. If you failed to meet them, you didn't just fail personally, you failed as a man. Marriage plays a huge role here. A wife and children weren't emotional relationships, they were credentials. Supporting a family was evidence that you had made it, that you were stable, respectable, and worthy of male recognition. If you weren't married, if you weren't providing, if you weren't climbing, the implication was clear. Something was unfinished about you, possibly defective. So yes, Victorian men were under pressure, but here's where we do not play the tiny violin too loudly for them. That pressure translated into control, into entitlement, into a system where women were expected to absorb male anxiety, ambition, and failure without complaint. Because if men were out there battling the world, then the home had to be a shrine, a place of peace, a place where nothing asked anything of them except to be comforted. And women were tasked with maintaining that illusion no matter the cost to themselves. So the home becomes sacred, and by sacred, I mean untouchable. Criticize it, and you're attacking morality itself. Question women's confinement there, and you're accused of undermining civilization. The private sphere is framed as above politics, which is incredibly convenient, because it means the inequalities inside it don't count. And that's the brilliance of separate spheres. By declaring the home apolitical, Victorian society made women's exclusion from power look like a personal choice rather than a structural one. It wasn't that women were barred, it was that they were better off elsewhere. So the home becomes a shrine where women are trapped, and men visit between battles for status. And that, more than lace or literature or etiquette, is the foundation this entire system is built on. So let's move on to our next section, the machine that made it all work. Separate spheres weren't just an idea that people politely agreed upon. It was an ideology that had to be taught, repeated, romanticized, and fed to girls like cough syrup. Unpleasant, mandatory, and allegedly for your own good. Victorian domesticity didn't spread through one law or one sermon. It spread through culture, through print, through endless advice, through the constant drip, drip, drip of what a real woman should be. This is where we meet the ideological factory, the domesticity machine. And like any good machine, it requires input. Magazines, manuals, novels, etiquette guides, fashion plates, and moral panics. It turns those inputs into outputs. Wives who believe their purpose is to disappear into a home and call it fulfillment. So let's say the quiet part out loud. A woman had one main role in life: to marry and take part in her husband's interests and business. Not her interests, not her ambitions, not her talents. Her job was to become the supporting character in a man's story and then be grateful she got cast at all. Victorian culture treats this as obvious, natural, and frankly adorable, and Victorian scholars later described it just as bluntly. Richard Altek, one of the pioneers of Victorian studies, summarized the logic in a way that is almost offensively clear. A woman was inferior to a man in all ways except the one that mattered most to a man: her femininity. Her place was in the home, on a veritable pedestal if one could be afforded, and emphatically not in the world of affairs. And I need everyone to hear that word pedestal, because as we discussed in last week's class on chivalry, a pedestal is just a stage for obedience. It's elevation without movement, praise without freedom, a decorative display stand where you are admired as long as you stay exactly where you're placed. A pedestal is not empowerment, it's containment with better lighting. Now, the Cult of Domesticity didn't just tell women where to stand, it handed them a whole moral checklist to live by, with the intensity of a church bulletin and all the warmth of an HR disciplinary meeting. The ideal true woman, we're told, must embody 4 cardinal virtues: piety, purity, submission, and domesticity. And these were not optional personality traits. They were the terms and conditions of respectability. Fail them, and you didn't just become imperfect, you became suspect, dangerous, fallen, a cautionary tale. First, let's look at piety. Religion was framed as the acceptable form of female self-improvement because it didn't threaten male authority. Unlike education, political involvement, or paid work, religion could be practiced in a way that kept women safely in the home. It encouraged humility, obedience, sacrifice, and endurance. It was spiritual training for the domestic role. Piety in this context is not women are religious. Piety is women are trained to accept their confinement as holy. Second, purity. Purity was a social currency, and virginity was treated like a family heirloom. It had to be guarded, displayed, and transferred correctly. A woman's purity was meant to be preserved until marriage, and then policed inside marriage through absolute fidelity. Meanwhile, men's sexual behavior was treated like weather. Sometimes storms happen. Very sad. Anyway, let's just hope he doesn't bring home syphilis with him to the marriage bed. Purity was also a trap, because it made women responsible for men's morality. If a man did stray, she clearly hadn't done her job right. If a man desired her, she must have provoked it. If a man harmed her, she must have been impure. Purity is a rigged game where women are punished for outcomes that they cannot control. Third, submission. And this is where the ideology stops pretending it's being subtle. True women were required to be submissive and obedient as little children. Not metaphorically, not childlike in the sense of innocent, childlike in the sense of you do not have authority over your life. You are meant to be guided, corrected, protected, controlled. Submission isn't romance, it's infantilization. It's patriarchy saying, I love you so much that I will make all your decisions for you. Fourth, domesticity. Domesticity was the crown jewel. A woman's proper place was the home, and her job was to create a refuge for her husband and children. Cooking, needlework, making beds, tending flowers, managing servants if she was wealthy enough to have them. And yes, this is also where we get the great Victorian fear that women might read something unapproved and become a person? Reading anything beyond religious biographies and morally safe material was discouraged because books could lead to ideas, and ideas could lead to dissatisfaction, and dissatisfaction could lead to women wanting things, and that's how society collapses, apparently. So when you see those 4 virtues laid out, what you're actually seeing is a complete identity system, a moral structure designed to shrink women's lives down to one acceptable shape. The wife, the mother, the domestic manager, the emotional sponge. The cult of domesticity doesn't just tell a woman to behave, it tells them what they are. And it doesn't rely on one authority figure to enforce this. It relies on a constant chorus of prescriptive literature. It's the Victorian version of an algorithmic feed, repetitive, seductive, and relentless. Advice manuals and women's magazines didn't just offer tips, they offered a worldview. They told women how to transform their homes into domestic sanctuaries for their husbands and children. A good home was framed as a moral achievement. A clean parlor wasn't just clean, it was proof you were virtuous. A well-run household wasn't just efficient, it was proof you were worthy. And fashion wasn't frivolous, fashion was policy. Women were expected to stay up to date, not for personal joy or artistic expression, but to please their husbands and reflect family respectability. Your body is your husband's social proof of success. Your clothes are your household brand. Your appearance is just another form of labor. That is also where motherhood gets sold as the ultimate fulfillment. Not simply one possible life path, but the natural, satisfying, spiritually complete purpose of womanhood. Motherhood is framed as a woman's primary contribution to society, a kind of national service performed in private. And this is how domestic ideology makes itself feel noble. It says, you aren't excluded from society, you are society. You just have to do it quietly, at home, without credit and without pay. Which brings us to the real function of prescriptive literature. It wasn't written to help women flourish, it was written to help women conform. These books didn't teach women how to live, they taught women how to vanish completely. And yet, because history is never tidy, there's a complication here, a wrinkle in the lace, a domesticity side quest, if you will. Sarah Josepha Hale, the longtime editor of Godey's Ladies book, is the perfect example of how this ideology could create limited, acceptable lanes for women's influence. Hale promoted women's education. She advocated for female physicians. She encouraged women to write. She published major female writers. She believed women could and should improve themselves intellectually and take moral action to shape their communities. That kind of sounds like progress, and in some ways it was. But notice the framing. Hale's vision still kept women's influence rooted in morality and respectable feminine authority. Not politics, not power, not equality as a direct challenge to male dominance. Women could influence society as moral guardians. They could reform, teach, write, and nurture. They could become educated, but in a way that strengthened their domestic mission rather than replacing it. This is how domestic ideology adapts. It creates safe outlets for women's ambition, as long as that ambition is translated into acceptable forms. You can be powerful, but only through virtue. You can lead, but only through self-sacrifice. You can change the world, but you have to call it charity instead of authority. And that's why the domesticity machine was so effective. It didn't always need to crush women directly. Sometimes it gave them a narrow hallway and called it freedom. So up to this point, we've been talking about ideology, about the stories Victorians told themselves to justify who gets to do what. Separate spheres, moral womanhood, the home as sanctuary, the pedestal as destiny. But ideology is only half the cage. The other half is enforcement. Because it's one thing to have a culture that praises women for staying home, it's another thing to have a legal system that makes it nearly impossible for them to do anything else. Victorian domesticity didn't just live in magazines and novels. It lived in the courts. It lived in contracts. It lived in the basic reality that a woman could be declared morally superior and still be treated by law like she wasn't fully a person. And nowhere is that clearer than in the act of marriage. Now, we'll get into this a lot more next week, but think of this as a little preview. Under the legal doctrine of coverture, a married woman effectively lost her legal existence. Her identity was folded into her husband's. In practical terms, she could not act as an independent legal agent in most of the ways we associate with adulthood. She could not easily own property in her own right, sue, or sign contracts. Her husband became the public face of the household and the legal authority within it. This is the part where people sometimes say, but they were protected. Right. Protected in the way a locked door protects you from the outside world. Protected in the way that a child is protected by being told, no, you don't get to decide that for yourself. When I lectured on this at the university level, I made this line very stark. Women had the same legal status as minors, criminals, and the insane. And yeah, that sounds dramatic until you remember what those categories represent. People society does not trust with autonomy. People presumed incapable of rational self-governance. People who must be supervised, controlled, and managed for their own good. If you're legally positioned as a child, obedience becomes natural. Submission isn't just a cultural expectation anymore, it's an institutional one. And this is why the cult of domesticity is not just the vibe of the era, it's a legal infrastructure. The angel in the house isn't merely praised for her softness, She's also constrained by a system that assumes she cannot and should not operate in public life as an equal human being. Now, yes, legal changes happened. By the late 19th century, reforms like Britain's Married Woman's Property Act of 1882 began to form cracks in that system, but it's important to notice what the timeline tells us. The domestic ideal rises, hardens, and lingers for decades while women's legal personhood remains restricted. The ideology is not a harmless cultural mood, it is the justification for keeping the law exactly as it is. And if you want to see how this ideology survives into the modern era, you don't even have to look far. You just have to cross the Atlantic and step into the early 20th century, where the same domestic logic reappears in a different costume: protective labor laws. On paper, these laws look benevolent. They claim to protect women from exploitation, from harsh hours, from unsafe working conditions. And some reformers absolutely meant well with what they were trying to do. But here's the trick. The rhetoric is care, the effect is constraint. Protective labor laws often limited women's working hours, prohibiting night work and barring women from certain occupations, which sounds like concern until you realize what it did in practice. It cost women jobs, it restricted their earning power, it narrowed their opportunities. It reinforced the idea that women's primary role was at home and that paid work was, at best, temporary and secondary. This is the cult of domesticity rewritten as policy. Women are too delicate to fully participate in the public economy, and therefore the state must intervene to keep them in their rightful place. And the best example of this logic becoming explicit is the U.S. Supreme Court case Mueller v. Oregon in 1908, a decision that upheld limiting women's work hours in part by framing women as inherently dependent and physically constrained by their reproductive roles. Let's pause and really savor how this gets framed, because it's the same Victorian argument just delivered with a gavel. The court described women as having dependency upon men. It argued that in the struggle for subsistence, she is not an equal competitor with her brother. It emphasized her physical structure and maternal functions, and claimed that protecting those functions was necessary, not just for her health, but for the well-being of the race. And then comes the part that is always the tell. The court said that the limitations on women's contractual rights were not imposed solely for her benefit, but also largely for the benefit of all. For the benefit of all. That's the phrase you should hear like a warning bell in a horror movie or a dystopian novel. Because for the benefit of all almost always means for the comfort of the existing social order. When the law says it's protecting you for the benefit of all, it's usually protecting society from the terrifying possibility that you might become ungovernable. And that's the point. The legal system didn't just reflect beliefs about gender, it operationalized them. It turned women are mothers into limitations on women's contractual freedom. It turned women belong at home into restrictions on women's economic independence. It turned women are delicate into policy that ensured women would remain financially vulnerable. This is also where you see the domestic ideology doing something especially insidious. It turns restriction into virtue. It turns inequality into moral order. It turns the denial of rights into an act of love. And when you look at the numbers, that impact becomes painfully concrete. In 1890, only 4.5% of married women were gainfully employed, compared to 40.5% of single women. That difference isn't about personal preference, it's structure. It's cultural expectation backed by legal reality. It's a society that treats marriage as a woman's full-time job and then acts surprised when women don't have an independent income. Marriage isn't just romance, it's an employment status change, a forced one. And when you understand that, the entire Victorian domestic ideal starts to look less like a sweet cultural artifact and more like what it actually was. A system designed to privatize women's labor, restrict women's movement, and legitimize male authority as the natural order of the world. Which brings us to the next step in the machine. What happens when women don't stay in their designated role anyway? When they work, when they want sex, when they resist, when they're poor, when they're fallen, when they exist outside the fantasy. Because Victorian society had a category for that. It had a whole moral taxonomy, and it didn't come with a pedestal. Here's the part where we take the angel in the house off her pedestal and look at the wiring underneath. Because the cult of domesticity is always sold as a universal idea, like it was simply what women were like, as if every woman in the 19th century woke up, sighed happily, and thought, I can't wait to spend my one wild and precious life being morally responsible for a grown man. But the cult only works if you pretend womanhood as a single unified experience. It depends on universal womanhood, the way a con artist depends on dim lighting. Once you turn on the overhead fluorescent truth, you see immediately that the angel in the house was a classed, raced, and imperialist fantasy. It wasn't all women. It was a very specific kind of woman, white, middle class, or wealthy, and positioned as the moral symbol of a household that could afford to treat her as a symbol rather than a worker. And even then, she was still trapped. But first, we need to talk about who wasn't even given the cage with the gold trim. Let's start with talking about working-class women, because the fantasy doesn't pay rent. The domestic ideal assumes something basic, a male breadwinner wage, a household income that can support a wife and children without requiring her labor. That's the foundation of the fantasy, and it immediately collapses the moment you look at actual working-class life. Because for working-class women, the Victorian separate spheres doctrine wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was an impossible standard they were trying to live up to. Working-class women worked, full stop. They worked in factories, agriculture, domestic service, laundries, piecework, shops, and informal labor that never makes it into the polite history books, because it didn't happen in drawing rooms. They did wage labor, they did unpaid labor, and often they did both in the same day. They were not fragile ornaments, they were economic survival units. Which is why the cult of domesticity functions less like an ideal and more like a weapon. It's not just a vision of what womanhood should be, it's a measuring stick used to shame women who couldn't afford to live up to it. It marks poor women as morally suspect because their reality doesn't match the fantasy. And you can see this difference even in education. Middle-class girls were trained in accomplishments education, a carefully curated curriculum designed to make them marriageable. Enough reading and music to seem refined, enough etiquette to perform class status, enough scholarship to be interesting but never threatening. Education as a decorative function. For working-class girls, education was often limited, interrupted, or treated as irrelevant because they were needed as earners in their families. They weren't being trained for a life of tasteful leisure and domestic management, they were being trained for labor. So while a middle-class girl was practicing piano and needlework to demonstrate delicacy and grace, a working-class girl was learning the skills of survival. How to take in washing, how to work long hours, how to handle physical exhaustion, how to navigate harassment and precarity. One version is presented as true womanhood, the other is presented as moral failure. That's not an accident. That's how class ideology hides inside gender ideology. The cult tells you what a good woman is, then defines goodness in a way that requires money. Now, we move on to the really complicated topic of enslaved and colonized women who were excluded from all of this by design. The Victorian world wasn't just Britain and its domestic sphere. It was empire. It was colonialism. It was commercial expansion. It was military campaigns packaged as progress. Patriarchal hierarchy ruled British culture, and the great imperial projects of the era rested on the masculine virtues of courage, conquest, and competition. Military and commercial expansion were framed as expressions of manhood. This came up way back in Arc 1 when we talked about exporting the binary. Hint, this is how my lectures always work. We revisit and build on the bones of my previous lectures. Missing a class is not recommended. This all means that the empire wasn't just built with gender roles in the background. The empire ran on gendered ideology. Men conquered, men administered, men mapped, claimed, extracted, and expanded. And white women, especially the respectable middle-class kind, were positioned as symbols of civilization. They were used as proof that empire was benevolent. Look, we brought domestic order. Look, we brought morality. Look, we brought you proper homes. The angel in the house was not just a domestic figure, she was an imperial symbol. And colonized women, enslaved women, they were excluded from the angel idea by design, because the ideal depended on their labor and their dehumanization. Colonized women were framed through racist narratives as either morally suspect, sexually uncontrolled, primitive, or in need of saving by the Western domestic order. They were treated as labor forces, domestic servants, or cautionary tales, not as delicate moral ornaments. Their lives were often controlled by colonial policies and economic systems that required their work while simultaneously denying them social recognition as proper women. Enslaved women, especially in the United States, were not just excluded from the cult of domesticity, they were positioned as the opposite of it. The cult constructed white womanhood as pure and black womanhood as inherently impure, hypersexual, available. That lie was useful. It justified sexual violence. It justified exploitation. It justified the refusal to see enslaved women as victims or even as fully human beings. And this matters because it shows how the universal ideal was built on exclusion. White domestic purity becomes a status marker that depends on someone else being cast as impure. The angel isn't just about gender, she's about hierarchy. She is the reward for being the right kind of woman in the right kind of household in the right kind of empire. And then, of course, there are the fallen women. Now, even among the women who were allowed to aspire to the angel idea, there was a trapdoor, a whole category created for women who slipped, or were pushed, or were simply unlucky. The fallen woman is the cult of domesticity's warning label. Purity operates as social currency. It's something you're supposed to possess and preserve, and if you lose it, your value collapses. But purity isn't just personal, it's reputational. It's tied to family honor, marriage prospects, class status, and public respectability, which means a woman's sexuality becomes not only a moral issue, but a social control mechanism. Adulteresses were labeled fallen and treated as moral failures in a way men rarely were for the same crimes. And under the contract of marriage and inequality, many women suffered abuse, sexual violence, and deprivation with little recourse. The system demanded silence from good women and punished bad women for failing to be silent. Which is why the angel and the fallen woman are two sides of the same system. One is rewarded for submission, the other is punished for stepping outside it. And the boundary between them is not always behavior. Sometimes it's circumstance. Sometimes it's poverty. Sometimes it's male violence. Sometimes it's one single rumor spread by the wrong person at the wrong time. The cult of domesticity pretends it's offering women safety, but it only offers safety to women who can perform perfectly, and even then it offers them safety in exchange for their autonomy. And while the system demanded purity and silence, it created an entire shadow economy for male desire. If the cult of domesticity is the official Victorian story about womanhood, then sex is the part of a script they tried to white out with holy water. Because Victorian society had a very specific fantasy it wanted to maintain. Good women are pure, calm, modest, and basically non-sexual. They exist to be wives and mothers, yes, but they are supposed to approach sex the way you approach taking medicine. Necessary, brief, done with minimal enthusiasm. Ideally, never discussed. Meanwhile, men are treated as permanently on the verge of moral collapse. Men, we are told, are physically strong, but morally weak. So naturally, they have urges. Naturally, they struggle. Naturally, they need outlets. This is presented as biology, fate, the weather, a tragic burden, whatever you want to call it. And because men are naturally like this, Victorian society builds an entire double standard around managing male desire while preserving the purity myth of respectable women. This is where the cult manufactures hypocrisy as a feature, not a bug. You get two categories: good women and bad women. The good women are the angels. The bad women become the pressure valve for male society. And then when anything goes wrong, you blame the bad women for existing. The Victorian approach to sex was not don't talk about it. It was make sure women don't know enough to challenge anything. Sex was taboo. Discussion was discouraged. Proper women were expected to be chaste, quiet, refined, modest, and generally devoid of anger, impatience, aggressiveness, or sexual appetite. Women were taught that their role was to be pure and to reserve sex for having children, not for pleasure or desire. The ideal wife is essentially a moral ornament who occasionally produces heirs. And because women weren't supposed to be sexual, they also weren't supposed to be informed. Lack of knowledge becomes part of the purity standard. If you don't know what's happening, you can't demand better. You can't negotiate. You can't set boundaries. You can't name violence. You can't even name your own dissatisfaction in the marriage bed. Men, on the other hand, are expected to have sexual urges and externalize them. A married man might not feel comfortable discussing sexual preferences with his wife because nice women aren't supposed to want such things. So the culture quietly builds an alternative sexual economy where men can do what they want without tainting their respectable wives. This is the Victorian sexual bargain. Keep the angel pure and outsource male desire. Which brings us to prostitution, the Victorian era's public secret. Only about a third of women were employed at any given time in the 19th century, but many who did work were concentrated in low-paying, dangerous jobs. Factory work, agriculture, domestic service, piecework, and the kinds of unskilled labor that grinds your body down for wages that barely keep you alive. And then there was prostitution. In Victorian London, estimates range wildly from about 8,000 to as high as 80,000 prostitutes. The range is huge because prostitution isn't one neatly documented profession. It's a set of survival strategies. Street work, brothels, informal arrangements, occasional sex work combined with other employment, sex work hidden behind the respectable front of service jobs. But the point remains, it was common enough that it became a core feature of the Victorian sexual system. And most importantly, it was often an economic necessity. The Victorian labor market didn't offer women many viable paths to independence. The jobs available were low-wage, high-risk, and often unstable. Prostitution, as brutal and dangerous as it was, could sometimes offer something those other jobs couldn't: cash, higher wages, shorter hours, the ability, in some cases, to earn in one night what factory work might pay you in a week. So while middle-class society moralized about fallen women, the economy quietly generated them. Sometimes women fell into a double life, working in a factory for little pay during the day, then working the streets at night to make ends meet. That is not a story of individual moral failure. That is a story of structural coercion. It's a story of wages and rent and food costs and the simple, violent math of survival. And because Victorian men wanted their desires met without corrupting respectable women, prostitution becomes the entire system's pressure valve. It's treated as necessary and shameful at the same time, like a sewer pipe everyone pretends not to see while relying on it constantly. Wealthy Victorian men could consult sporting guides, which functioned like shopping catalogs of women. These books listed prostitutes' ages, physical descriptions, personality types, and cost, allowing men to browse and choose in advance. The consumer marketplace of women's bodies wasn't metaphorical, it was literal, it was indexed. So the culture insists that women are naturally pure and then creates an industry to serve male sexuality while preserving that illusion. And then the cherry on top, it blames the women in that industry for everything. The hypocrisy becomes even more obvious when you get to the moral panic over sexually transmitted infections. As more and more wives became infected with diseases like syphilis, public anxiety escalated. But where did that anxiety land? On the men who were spreading infections between prostitutes and their wives? No, of course not. On the women who were already socially disposable. Victorian logic goes like this: men will be men. Prostitutes are the problem. And this is where the state steps in with what can only be described as weaponized public health. The Contagious Diseases Acts were framed as pragmatic responses to protect public health, especially in military contexts. In reality, they treated women's bodies as sites of state control. They required women suspected of prostitution to submit to forced internal examinations for STDs, and if they were found to be infected, they could be confined in locked hospitals, state violence justified as medical necessity. Notice what's missing from this entire story: the men. The men who were buying sex were not the ones being examined, not the ones being detained, not the ones being publicly marked as dangerous for public health. The state did not treat male desire as the problem. It treated female bodies as the containment system for male behavior. Which brings us to Josephine Butler. And honestly, thank God for Josephine Butler. Butler was a middle-class evangelical Christian, which is part of what makes her activism so culturally explosive. She wasn't a bohemian radical. She wasn't someone Victorian society could easily dismiss as immoral. She was respectable, and she used that respectability like a battering ram. Butler campaigned against the Contagious Disease Acts on the grounds that they were violent, unjust, and fundamentally unequal. She argued that women, even prostitutes, had rights over their own bodies, that they had the right to refuse invasive medical procedures, that the state could not treat them as disposable containers for male disease. And the fact that she chose to advocate for prostitutes was shocking precisely because the whole system depended on prostitutes being unworthy of sympathy. The fallen woman had to stay fallen, or else the entire category would collapse. This is one of the most important connective threads in this episode, because it shows how feminism doesn't emerge in a vacuum of abstract theory. It emerges from violence. Bodily autonomy is the core here. The STD panic and the state response to prostitution helped shape early feminist organizing because it forced a question that Victorian society did not want to answer. Who owns women's bodies? The Contagious Diseases Acts made it explicit that the state felt entitled to access women's bodies in the name of public order. Butler's campaign and the broader movement that supported her became a platform for bodily autonomy, not in the modern language we use today, but in a foundational sense. The right to say no, the right to refuse, the right to not be medically violated because men want consequences without responsibility. And this is why the cult of domesticity is never just about the home. It's about control. It's about categorizing women into respectable and disposable, then using the disposable ones to stabilize the respectable fantasy. Which sets us up for what comes next. The medicalization of disobedience. Because if Victorian society couldn't shame you into submission and couldn't legally contain you, it had another option. It could diagnose you. By now, the pattern should feel uncomfortably familiar. Victorian society had a problem. Women were expected to be compliant, domestic, pure, grateful, quiet. But women, inconveniently, continued to be human. They got angry, they got depressed, they got restless, they wanted things. They were exhausted, they resisted, they broke rules, they broke down. They didn't always smile politely on the pedestal like a decorative object that never needs sleep. So the system needed a way to explain women's non-compliance without admitting that the system itself was the problem. Enter medicine. The Victorian era didn't just enforce gender through culture and law, it enforced it through diagnosis. And one of the most effective tools in that arsenal was the concept of female madness, especially the all-purpose label of hysteria. Because if a woman is unhappy in her domestic cage, you have two choices. You can ask whether the cage is the problem, or you can decide that she's insane for noticing. This move is older than the Victorians, which is important. The idea that women who resist marriage, obedience, or male authority must be irrational, unstable, or unfit for society doesn't originate in the 19th century. It shows up clearly in late 18th century literature, most notably in Mary Wollstonecraft's Maria, or The Wrongs of Woman. In Maria, the title character is confined to a private asylum not because she is mad, but because she is inconvenient. Her husband has her locked away after she attempts to leave an abusive marriage. The asylum becomes a legal and social loophole, a place where women can be disappeared under the guise of care. Wollstonecraft is brutally clear about what's happening. Madness is not a medical fact, it's a justification, a tool, a way to turn female resistance into a pathology and male violence into prudence. By the time we reach the Victorian period, that logic hasn't been corrected, it's been refined. Madness becomes the convenient explanation for any deviation. A woman who deviates from the ideal can be dismissed, controlled, removed, reclassified as a problem to be managed rather than a person with legitimate grievances. If she resists, she's not oppressed, she's unwell. And if she's unwell, the people controlling her are not being abusive, they're being caretakers. Social control gets to dress up as treatment. This isn't theoretical, it shows up in the institutional reality of the period. Surveys and records reveal a disproportionate number of women in asylums. That doesn't mean women were inherently more prone to mental illness, it means the definition of illness was shaped by gender norms. The category of madness was completely elastic. It could stretch to include anything that made a woman inconvenient. Which brings us to hysteria, the Victorian diagnosis that functioned like a catch-all trash can for female noncompliance. The symptoms were absurdly broad. Hysteria could mean faintness, nervousness, insomnia, convulsions, irritability, melancholy, anxiety, emotional outbursts, sexual desire, lack of sexual desire, and most damningly, a tendency to cause trouble. It's hard to miss the real definition here. Hysteria often meant women behaving in a way that makes men uncomfortable. In 1859, one physician claimed that over a quarter of women suffered from hysteria. Over a quarter. That should immediately tell you what kind of diagnosis this was. If something supposedly affects 25% of women and includes nervousness and insomnia as symptoms, you're not describing a rare disease. You're just describing life under patriarchy. The medical logic behind hysteria was aggressively sex-based. Doctors believed it was intrinsically linked to women's sexual satisfaction and the womb, meaning men could not suffer from it. Clearly. That reasoning sounds laughable now, but it functioned as power then. If the womb is the source of disorder, women's bodies become the excuse for controlling women's lives. Sexism becomes science. Patriarchy becomes medical fact. Charlotte Perkins Gilman makes this explicit in The Yellow Wallpaper, which is essentially a horror story about what happens when a woman's distress is treated as diagnosis instead of a warning sign. The narrator is subject to the rest cure, isolated from work, creativity, and autonomy in the name of recovery. Her husband, a physician, insists that her suffering is imaginary, nervous, temporary, and as she is increasingly denied agency, stimulation, and voice, she does not recover. She deteriorates. Gilman isn't subtle about the metaphor. The wallpaper becomes a symbol of confinement. The creeping woman behind it becomes a reflection of the narrator herself. The story lays bare the violence of medical paternalism. When women's perceptions are dismissed as symptoms, reality itself becomes inaccessible. And again, this isn't about Victorian weirdness. It's about utility. Hysteria allowed physicians to reinterpret normal or misdiagnosed conditions through a gendered lens. Epilepsy, for example, was sometimes mistaken for hysteria. Women could be institutionalized or treated for a supposed female disorder when they were experiencing something else entirely. And the label stuck because it served a social purpose. Accuracy didn't matter, usefulness did. Because the madness label does something very specific. It strips women of credibility. If you're hysterical, your complaints don't count. Your anger is irrational. Your desires are symptoms. You don't need rights. You need management. That's why medicalization is part of the cage. It's not just about hospitals and diagnoses. It's about authority. Men define women's distress as illness and then claim the right to supervise the solution. And yes, some Victorian treatments for hysteria were exactly as grim and revealing as you'd expect. Doctors sometimes prescribed more frequent intercourse for married women, framed as a cure for nervous agitation. Others recommended pelvic massage or vibration on the assumption that symptoms were caused by sexual frustration. None of this was framed as pleasure. Let's be clear here, they were not prescribing orgasms for women because they thought that women would enjoy them. It was framed as treatment because the entire logic depended on denying women sexual agency while still manipulating women's bodies in the name of male authority. The point here is not that Victorians were uniquely strange. The point is that medicine became an enforcement arm of societal norms. It offered a way to punish women without calling it punishment. It offered a way to lock women away while calling it care. So if you didn't fit the angel mold, society had options: shame you, police you, or institutionalize you. At least the Victorian era hadn't heard of lobotomies yet, but we'll get to that in another episode. If we ended this story with the angel still perched on her pedestal, smiling through clenched teeth while the law, medicine, and morality held her in place, this would be a bleak episode. Accurate, yes, but bleak. The good news is, Victorians could build cages, but they couldn't stop women from noticing the bars. And once people notice the bars, they start doing something that terrifies any rigid social system. They start narrating the cage as a cage. This is where we pivot from the machinery of domesticity to the sabotage. Not always loud, not always feminist in the modern sense. Sometimes it comes wrapped in comedy, satire, and plausible deniability. Sometimes it comes as a play that detonates in the middle of polite society and leaves everyone pretending it was just a personal drama. Sometimes it comes in the form of a queen who embodies the contradiction so perfectly it feels like the system accidentally told on itself. This act is about rebellion, about the ways the angel in the house gets stabbed repeatedly, not by one heroic blow, but by 1,000 cuts. Jokes that expose the script, narratives that refuse the ending, women who insist they have a self. Let's start with Oscar Wilde, because sometimes the fastest way to kill an ideology is to make it laughable. In The Importance of Being Earnest, we meet Cecily and Gwendolyn, who are, to put it mildly, fixated on the name Ernest. It's not just a preference, it's an obsession. It's practically a religious conviction for them. My ideal has always been to love someone of the name of Ernest. There is something in that name that inspires absolute confidence. The moment Algernon first mentioned to me that he had a friend called Ernest, I knew I was destined to love you." On the surface, it reads like a silly romantic comedy. Two women obsessing over a name because it inspires confidence. Ha ha! Women are silly, marriage is silly, tea is served, the curtain falls. Except if you read it in the context of the Victorian marriage economy, Cecily and Gwendolen aren't shallow. They're not stupid. They're reacting to the reality that marriage is the only sanctioned destiny for a woman of their class. Their economic security, social legitimacy, and basic future prospects are bound up in choosing a husband. So of course they're obsessed with signals. They live in a world where men's character is brand management, where respectability is performance, and where women are expected to secure their entire life through a single choice and then live with it forever. Ernest becomes a brand label for moral masculinity. It's not a name, it's a certification. It's the Victorian equivalent of a blue checkmark. Cecily and Gwendolen are clinging to the fantasy that you can spot virtue by reading the label on the box. And Wilde's satire is brutal because it exposes what the cult tries to hide. The marriage script is not romantic destiny, it's social infrastructure. Women are trained to treat marriage like the main plot because society refuses to give them any other plots. So Wilde stabs the angel by mocking the whole performance. If earnestness can be faked with a name, then the moral superiority of the domestic ideal is just that: theater, lace and lies. And then, just when you've laughed enough to let your guard down, Victorian culture hands you something a bit sharper. Henrik Ibsen's A Doll's House is not subtle sabotage. It's a controlled demolition. Nora Helmer begins the play as the ideal domestic figure. Charming, playful, carefully contained. Her husband treats her like a pet, a child, a decorative object. The whole house runs on the assumption that her job is to be delightful, obedient, and grateful. And then the play does the one thing that Victorian domestic ideology cannot survive. It treats Nora as a person, with an inner life that matters more than her performance. By Act 3, Nora realizes that her marriage has been a kind of staged domestic shrine. Her husband's love is conditional, his respect is non-existent, and the home, supposedly her natural realm, has been built around containing her. Then comes the exchange that cracked polite society open.
Something else has to happen first. I have to bring myself up. You're not the man to do that for me. I have to do that on my own. That's why I'm leaving you now.
What did you say?
I have to be on my own if I am to get to understand myself and everything outside. That's why I can't stay here any longer.
No, Nora.
I'm leaving straight away. I'm sure Christina will put me up for the night.
This is madness. You're out of your mind. I won't let you. I forbid it.
It's no use you forbidding me anything anymore. I'll take what belongs to me. I don't want anything of yours, either now or later.
This is madness.
Tomorrow I'll go home, to my old hometown, I mean. It should be easier for me to find something to do there.
You poor, blind, inexperienced creature.
You must see that I get some experience, Torvald.
But you're leaving your home, your husband, and your children. Haven't you thought what people will say?
I can't think about that. I only know that it's necessary for me.
This is outrageous. You're betraying your most sacred duty.
What do you consider my most sacred duty to be?
Do I have to tell you? It's your duty to your husband and your children.
I have another duty just as sacred.
You have not. But what could that be?
My duty to myself.
First and foremost, you are a wife and mother.
Oh, I don't believe that any longer. I believe that first and foremost, I am a human being, just as you are, or at least that I must try to become one.
This conversation is scandalous because it rejects the entire moral logic of the cult. Nora is supposed to be duty incarnate, but only duty to others, to husband, child, home. When she claims a duty to herself, she is claiming personhood, and personhood is the one thing the angel in the house ideology cannot grant without collapsing. Nora rejecting the domestic shrine is the act of stabbing the angel right in the sentimental heart. She refuses to play the role of moral ornament. She refuses to be infantilized. She refuses to stay for the sake of appearances. She chooses self-realization over respectability. And the reason this caused a cultural uproar is simple. It put words to a possibility women weren't supposed to even imagine. It's not that she just leaves, it's that she asserts she has the right to do it. And once you say that out loud, it's hard to unsay it. But now let's talk about the woman who becomes the living symbol of Victorian gender ideology, even as her existence exposed its contradictions. Queen Victoria. Victoria's upbringing was deeply controlled under the Kensington system, which kept her isolated and dependent, allowed access only to approved people, and treated her like a project to be managed. She takes the crown unmarried, which forces her to continue living under her mother's authority until marriage. From the beginning, her story is shaped by a fear of impropriety and a hunger for control. Then, once she is queen, the monarchy deliberately rebrands itself as moral and domestic. Under Victoria, royal symbolism becomes family monarchy, designed to appeal to middle-class respectability in contrast to the scandals of the earlier royals. The crown is repackaged as virtue, the empire is wrapped in propriety, the monarchy becomes a domestic brand, and Victoria leans into it. Her authority rests heavily on her image as both queen and woman, especially as mother, both to her children and symbolically to the empire. She embodies the ideals of domestic morality at the very top of the social hierarchy. And yet the contradiction is glaring. Under her reign, women could not vote, could not sue, could not own property in the way men could. The public arena remained masculine by definition. Victoria saw herself in positions as exceptional, not as a precedent for other women. She wasn't an argument for women's equality, she was the exception that proved the rule. And she said so, explicitly. In a famous statement, Victoria raged against women's rights as this mad, wicked folly, insisting that God created men and women different and then let them remain each in their own position. That's not the voice of a woman quietly trapped by the system, that's the voice of a woman protecting it. Victoria becomes a symbol and a contradiction because she personifies the Victorian gender story. A woman can be powerful only by being framed as exceptional, and even then she must defend the ideology that keeps other women contained. Her existence proves women can govern, but her politics insist that women should not. That tension is the era in miniature. And so by the end of this episode, we've watched the angel get stabbed from multiple angles, satire that exposes the marriage script, drama that insists on selfhood, and monarchy that reveals how the ideology survives by treating powerful women as anomalies rather than evidence. And here's where we land it. The angel isn't just a woman, she's a cultural tool. And once you see her as a tool, you start spotting her everywhere. So here's what I want to leave you with, because the Victorian era is not a sealed tomb we poke at for fun. It's a haunted house that we keep renovating. The cult of domesticity didn't die when the century turned. It didn't vanish when women gained more legal rights. It didn't evaporate because a few writers stabbed the angel in the house in the literary ribs. It just changed outfits. It learned a new vocabulary. It got a better publicist. You can see its fingerprints all over the 20th century, especially in the big post-war domestic revival of the 1950s, the era that my broader work comes back to again and again because it's basically when Victorian domestic ideology gets repackaged with modern appliances and a marketing budget. The same story returns. Women are happiest in the home. Motherhood is their natural fulfillment, and male breadwinning is the moral foundation of society. Only now it's sold through television, advertising, suburban architecture, and Cold War anxiety about American values. The home becomes a patriotic battlefield. The wife becomes the symbol of national stability, and the pedestal comes with a matching refrigerator. And then there's the language, the protective language, the paternalistic rhetoric that claims to care while quietly restricting. That doesn't stop either. It persists in policy debates where women's bodies are treated as public property for the good of society, where reproductive autonomy becomes a moral panic, and where restrictions are framed as benevolent safeguards rather than control. It's the same logic we saw with protective labor laws and medical authority. We're limiting you for your own good, for the benefit of all, for the family, for the children, for civilization. Meanwhile, modern purity culture shows up like Victorian piety with a social media strategy. We get abstinence messaging, modesty policing, virginity is worth, and the same old division between good girls and bad girls, only now it's algorithmically amplified and monetized. And tradwife aesthetics? That's the angel in the house wearing linen and pretending the cage is a lifestyle choice. Soft lighting, hard ideology. And because this story is always the same at its core, the rhetoric never really changes. Women are framed as moral guardians, as emotional stabilizers of men and children, and the glue holding everything together. And if the family falls apart, or the culture gets degenerate, or society feels anxious, somehow the blame always boomerangs back to the women. Not to the institutions, not to the laws or the systems of power, to women, for failing to be angelic enough. Which brings us back to the core idea of this whole episode. The Cult of Domesticity assigns women responsibility for morality and family stability while denying them power and autonomy. It hands women an impossible job and punishes them for failing to perform it to perfection. It praises them for virtue while making sure virtue has no leverage in society. It calls the cage a sanctuary and calls obedience love. So if you take nothing else from this, take this. The angel in the house was never a compliment. It was a leash made of lace. If this episode made your brain do a little click where you realize, oh, that's why that modern thing keeps bothering me, share it. Text it to a friend. Post it. Send it to the person in your life who keeps telling you that women are just naturally better suited to the home, as if nature personally drafted a job description and posted it on LinkedIn. And if you're listening on a platform where you can subscribe, follow, or leave a review, do that too. It helps more than you'd think, because the algorithm is basically the Victorian moral police in a different hat, and I would like to recommend this show to people who need it. Come back next week when we dive into the next cage that women were taught to yearn for. Marriage. I'm Professor Meredith, and this is Bitchy History.
History.
History. History. History.
History.
What a bitch, right?